Glad to introduce the panel that we have today. First is Sid Espinosa, who is the Director for Technology and Corporate Responsibility at Microsoft. Sid's career has spanned government, business, and nonprofit sectors. He's currently the Director of Philanthropy and Civic Engagement at Microsoft, focused on the most innovative uses of technology to address social, community, and development challenges. Mr. Espinosa served as the mayor of Palo Alto, California, and was previously the Director of Global Philanthropy at Hewlett-Packard Company. He has worked for U.S. Ambassador overseas, served as an aide to former U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno at the U.S. Department of Justice, and worked in the speechwriting and public liaison offices in the White House. He served on numerous nonprofit, university, and business boards of directors. Sid holds degrees from Wesleyan and Harvard universities. Louise Dubé. Louise has significant experience in growing organizations in educational technology and digital media. Most recently, she was the Managing Director of Digital Learning at WGBH. There, Louise helped launch PBS Learning Media, a platform with over 87,000 classroom-ready digital resources, reaching 1.5 million educators. Previously, as president of Pangea Tools, Louise led an education software startup with 60 staff members that was successfully acquired by Houghton Mifflin. She's held executive positions at Time to Know, Scientific Learning, and Soliloquy Learning, and holds a law degree from McGill University, as well as an MBA from Yale. Louise will oversee iCivics strategic division, development, operations, and collaborations among a diverse network of partners, including BrainPop, Glass Lab, Electronic Arts, National Geographic, and others. David Moren, the Bay Area Executive Director for Generation Citizen, which is a nonpartisan action civics organization that provides middle and high school youth with the knowledge and skills needed to actively participate in democracy. David's also a citizenship fellow with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, as well as a recent 3-year racial equity fellow with the W.G. Kellogg Foundation. Recently, David was a proud guest on KQED Forum and a Bay Area resident for and has been a Bay Area resident for over a decade. Currently lives in the East Bay with his wife and 2 young children. Charlie Wisoff, welcome, is the founder and CEO of Civnet. Charlie's LinkedIn mission statement is that my passion is creating systems that empower people to make change in civic and political life. Previously, Charlie was associated with the Kettering Foundation. He holds a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Brown University. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for participating. We've focused a lot today on civic engagement, primarily amongst adults, business, and nonprofit leaders. And we're going to shift the focus a little bit to students today, this afternoon. And I want to start, before I ask the first question, by just setting some clarifying definitions so that all of the panelists and audience members are on the same page. People often use the terms civic engagement and civic education interchangeably, but they're actually different. Civics education, I would define as teaching students or adults the 3 following things: how government works at every level, how to discern the validity of information that one sees, reads, or hears, and how to engage in civil discourse with people with whom one disagrees. Civic engagement, on the other hand, is facilitating the active participation of students or adults in the political process, which could be through political advocacy, social activism, civic tech, and others that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So I'm going to start with a question, one question for each of you to kick us off today. And Sid, I'll begin with you. Corporate responsibility covers a broad range of issues, from advocating for favorable legislation to philanthropy to workforce development. What role do you see large companies playing in facilitating greater civic engagement, either by employees or in the larger community, or the students in the community? How does Microsoft benefit from a more engaged citizenry?
Sure. Well, there's so many different aspects of this conversation, talking about engagement in civic life. I think it's sort of everybody seems to be talking about it now, post the last election, in good and bad ways. But the bottom line is, for us at Microsoft, we have seen over the last decade a change, a fundamental change in the way that citizens can and students can and businesses and nonprofits can engage with government through technology. And there's a revolution taking place there in a host of different ways, and that's why we as a company are actively engaged in it. Just by way of our involvement, I'll highlight 3 areas of investment, because we've been investing a lot in civic tech in recent years, in civic engagement, and in civics education, all 3. One is really thinking about the area of civic tech. There are tools, technology tools that are being used to connect citizens to their government, to mobilize them around issues, to open up transparency, participatory budgeting, et cetera. There are so many ways to think about how to revolutionize how government provides services, how it communicates with its citizenry, how they're mobilized on their own, et cetera, through technology. And we're making major investments in that area. Another area for us is our employees. It's an incredible pool of engaged and involved people, and we want to make sure that they're out there and involved. Everything from supporting their volunteerism and doing everything we can to get them out into the community involved in issues that they care about, but also launching a civic fellows program to allow people to take a sabbatical from Microsoft and go and work in government agencies and think about how they can bring their knowledge and skill set to those issues and to those organizations. The third is thinking about, we're a partner organization, so we're thinking about who to work with on these issues. And just as I was getting up stage, I was reading about our work, folks on my team who have been on the board and working for years with Generation Citizen, which we'll hear about in a moment. There are organizations out there that are really changing the way that youth and young adults are thinking about their communities, how to solve problems, how to galvanize other people, how to influence policy, which is what's so unique about this organization. So those investments for us are also critically important. So whether it's the technology, the mobilization of our employees, or the partners, we're thinking about these issues in ways because we see that we're at a unique point in time and the potential there for really impacting communities, impacting policy, impacting citizenship.
Thank you. He just about threw the next question to you, Louise. And I just want to note, this is here as a timer, so I can keep track of the time. I'm not texting, as an aside. Louise, EdTech is a rapidly growing market these days. Companies are heavily promoting personalized online learning, and learning through online games is clearly a trend that seems to be capitalizing on today's youth's connection to their screens. I'm interested to hear how you see civic tech, iCivics, bridging the gap between game playing and transformative classroom experiences.
Right. So when people talk about ed tech, we talk about one thing. It's not one thing. There are so many different ways that we can use technology in the classroom. There's really no other way, right? We live in a technology, in a digital world now, and so we have to use it. The key here is to make sure that we use technology for what it's best at. In the case of gaming, we think of gaming as beyond technology, that we have online gaming, we have offline gaming as well at iCivics. So we do both. There are many things that you can't experience without technology. So you cannot understand how our national election cycle goes without having some kind of tool that models that, right? And no matter if you try to do it in your classroom, it'd be really, really hard. So that's the kind of problem that we want to illustrate through a gaming platform. I have seen so many light bulbs go off in kids, particularly kids who are disengaged with education the way it's normally done. So turn on by gaming because that's the platform they're used to. I think we have to think about it that way. Gaming is really a revolution now, and we need to get in that game in order to actually do good. So we think about it in those kinds of ways. And personalized learning is a slice of that. It's not the whole of it. What we want is an active, engaged classroom where kids are paying attention. They will not learn anything unless they're paying attention. And then we want to use that knowledge to turn them into active citizens and residents of their community. So that link, we have worked with Generation Citizen to do that, right? Once they understand how the system works, they become by themselves engaged in the process, and that's when a lot of action can happen.
Thank you. David, Generation Citizen takes a different approach to classroom learning and engagement, maybe slightly lower tech, but highly participatory. What do you believe the key elements to impacting students, to student engagement look like long after the Gen Citizen trainers have left the classroom?
Yes, well, I just want to say thank you to Innovate Your State for having us here, but if I had my druthers, I would actually rather have one of our youth up here speaking on our behalf, but they're caught up in this pesky thing called school, so I'm pitch hitting for them. But really, I think the most effective way that we can make a case for investing in our youth is hearing directly from them. So for what that's worth, I just wanted to have that front and center. If you talk to political scientists, they sort of uniformly have found that the most powerful way to engage students to participate in civic or political activities is to invite them to participate. And so similar to how iCivics goes and meets students where they're at using technology, we literally go and meet students where they're at, where we go into the school, in the classroom during the school day, and we quickly put them in the driver's seat and we say, well, what's important to you? What are you experiencing on a daily basis, on a local level, that's impacting your life? And then we give them the knowledge and the skills they need to learn how to take action on it. So instead of sort of the traditional rote learning model of memorizing facts, and that somehow is supposed to turn you into an effective, engaged citizen, we say, well, knowledge is important, but it's really only one leg of the stool. We really need them to also have the civic skills and the civic disposition. So the more we can kind of build out that ecosystem of, sure, memorizing facts is fine, but what are you going to do with it? And if you're not terribly motivated to want to participate, then what's it all for? So Generation Citizen is all about baking into their educational experience what it means to be an active, engaged citizen. And by having the students themselves choose a local issue, as Louise was saying, there's much more higher relevance to why they want to participate. And what we see is that with a lot of students, they may not be doing well in other aspects of their academic life or personal life, but when they're asked to activate their personal agency, that's when they start to lean in and really want to participate. So for us, it's really about activating that civic disposition and getting them to want to participate now and not waiting till they turn 18 and seeing like registering to vote as the first act of civic participation, but in fact, starting to unpack some of those issues in the classroom in real life application.
Thank you. And to the extent that students are not getting there while they're in school, there are programs like Civnet to help afterwards. Charlie, you transitioned from the Kettering Foundation to Civnet in order to find ways to promote deeper social engagement between people who want to organize together for the common good. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that you think that has on civil discourse?
Sure. When I was at Kettering, that was one of the really big focuses, how people deliberate about issues and how that affects the legitimacy of the political system. And as that pertains to education, there's a lot of issues around accountability. How are we defining accountability in a school system in a way that resonates with what the community wants? How is that actually reflected in policy? As I've transitioned to civic tech and Civnet, I think I would, emphasize what David said, which is it's really about promoting bottom-up civil discourse and bottom-up engagement and letting the youth drive it, because the way our society is structured, you have a situation, particularly in community organizing, where there's a very long history and it's justified of we've been doing this for 30 years and this is the way things should be done in the community. And there's great reason for that, because you often have outsiders coming in who are trying to tell communities how to do things, but what we've noticed through the use of our platform, our platform is not used just for youth, it's used for a variety of civic engagement projects. What we've noticed is that that same culture also tends to say to young people, well, you don't really have a voice, we know how to do things and you need to learn from us. And so I think what's really interesting is figuring out if you can create technology that balances and respects that tradition and that knowledge that's been in communities for a long time, but also makes a place for new people, in this case youth, to contribute their voice contribute to the civil discourse and not just give input, but direct the course of action. And that's, I think, a really interesting challenge that I don't think we've solved yet, but it's something that we're definitely grappling with and trying to figure out how the communication piece digitally and online affects that dynamic.
Thank you. Let's talk about money for a minute. Since many say that budgets reflect statements of values, this question is really directed to Sid and Charlie in the for-profit sector, as opposed to the nonprofits that are looking to raise money. In the past 15 years, private companies have poured money into STEM programs in schools through after-school summer enrichment programs and in local institutions that have the capacity to reach students. What role do you see the private sector playing on a large scale to also increase and enrich civics education and engagement at our schools? Certainly not suggesting that the money should be shifted away from STEM, but perhaps the pot expanded to include civics education. What argument would you make to your shareholders that it's just as important for schools to produce civically educated, aware, and engaged citizens as it is to produce graduates who are competent in science and math?
Start? Well, just to give you a sense of the scale for us, at Microsoft this year, our investments in nonprofits and schools around the world will be over $1 billion. And there are civics programs that we fund within that, though, as was mentioned, the vast majority is in STEM funding. I think what's interesting about this region with so much wealth and so much tech wealth in particular is that you'll find that every nonprofit sector and issue is focused on why tech isn't. So there are whole conferences on like, why are the arts being left behind? What about all the health issues like breast cancer and leukemia and no one's doing AIDS? Where's the veterans or the homeless? Or so like, how do we get tech to focus on that community? The flip side of that is recognizing why tech has been focused on STEM, and then I'll come back to civics. I think it is core to the business, number one. It is a crisis in our country that we know that the fastest growing job sectors and the highest paying jobs all have a computational thinking component, but we're fundamentally not training kids for that. So few kids have even access to a computer science class, access to it by the time they graduate from high school. Most tech companies would tell you, we don't want to be in the business of funding STEM and STEM programming. We want this to become policy, part of curriculum development, teacher training, pipeline fixed, so that we don't have to fund it. The goal for us is not to have to fund it in the end. But it is such a crisis. I mean, at Microsoft, we have 6,000 jobs right now open that have a CS component that we cannot fill in the United States, and every tech company is going to tell you these stories. So it is core to our business interests. That's why you find the STEM. But coming back to it, if you were to, there are other areas of focus. In corporate responsibility, for most companies, we are engaging in a community locally where our employees live and work, figuring out what are the issues there that are of greatest importance and what value add can we bring? What is the connection for us? So in San Jose, we focus on transportation. We have worked on programs in affordable housing. We've worked on these core issues. And I think one of the issues one of the challenges, if you will, as we talk about civics and civics education and civic engagement is showing the problem and the crisis, helping the business community recognize that they have something of value there, that this is a challenge for the communities in which they operate, and then showing that there is a way that they can engage where they can either move the needle, change something in particular, scale something. They want to make a difference, right? The business community wants to not be just a permanent funding source, but they want to solve something within that. They want to tackle something. And I think we just haven't gotten to that point yet in the broader context of the conversation related to civics.
Thank you. San Jose Unified, just for the record, is adding computer science courses exponentially throughout the middle school and high schools. Yeah. What do you want to add to that, Charlie?
Well, we don't have a whole plethora of investors that I can really say how they think about this issue. So I'll talk about it from the perspective of a tech co-founder or a tech founder. when I hire people who have tech skills, I think one of the things that is often missing and really valuable are the soft skills. And it's not to say that there isn't a gap in the skill set for computational thinking and skills, but it makes such a difference when someone has that and can also communicate well versus someone who can't. And I think the civic space is an area where we really learn a lot of those soft skills and how to work in small groups, and there's definitely a case to be made for that. Another interesting example, on the other end, an example that comes up is taking sort of the business tech methodology. There's a charter school that we work with. We're based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They're, it's sort of trying to apply the startup methodology to students. They do their 4 years, and by the end of the 4 years, they have developed a pitch for a business idea that they're working with in the community. And the role we play with them is to help them communicate and find opportunities to engage in the community so that their business actually resonates with the community. But I think what's interesting there is you can sort of parlay that same thinking about investing specifically in tech and broadening the definition of that to things like small business, and how do we apply this same thinking and way of doing things in other sectors. And I think that's a way to attract investment that might normally go into STEM, because you can say that, hey, we're applying this in this other way that's also really meaningful.
Thank you. Emma and David, both of your programs have an equity bent, which is to say that a good part of your mission is to reach students who may on their own have fewer opportunities to become civically engaged, or who may see fewer role models who can demonstrate the importance of this type of activity. In an ideal world, where perhaps California didn't rank in the bottom 10 of bottom 10 of state per pupil funding, what do you think should be the purview of public schools regarding civics education and engagement, and what role should be played by non-government entities such as businesses or nonprofit organizations such as your own?
So I think the first thing to say is that in civic education, equity is the problem, right? So schools in more affluent districts have a panoply of services that are mainly funded by additional sources, revenues beyond. And so that's the question, is what do we do in constricted school budgets for a fundamental school? So the basic premise of schools when they were initially set up in this country were to graduate, engage, and inform citizens, right? So we've got to go back to the basic premise. So I actually think it is a school budget issue. The problem is the equity gap, right? If you look at the research, it's about $10,000 or $11,000 of additional funding is provided to a more affluent kid than a less affluent kid. And that's the gap that I think the business community and others could really help to equalize in a way to show how it could be done at scale. And then hopefully we could get to a point where schools could be able to take that up on their own. For us, in terms of games, what we try to do is to encapsulate the best way to teach something and make it super affordable. It costs us 50 cents per kid in order to provide games for free to all the kids that we serve, 5 million a year. So that's a super efficient way to do it. It's not the only way. The teacher has to be involved. She has to be, or he has to be in the mix. But we think we have an efficient way to do it. We just need a way to equalize the resources. That's very important.
Well, as Sid said, in the private sector, they wish they didn't have to invest in this because the pipeline was already established. I mean, in a dream world, Generation Citizen and other nonprofits like ours, we would like to be out of business because we'd like to see schools getting the funding that they deserve to implement a robust action civics program so that all students across the country are getting this as a matter of course. Until that time happens, I think it's incumbent on policymakers and educators and nonprofits and the business community to kind of set schools up to be training grounds for democracy, as Louise was saying. That was the essence of why they were set up. The fact is that, we might take certain things for granted, but for Generation Citizen, we prioritize low-income students, because that's where there's the biggest civic engagement gap. And we know that because not all of them are going to go to college or not all of them are going to get high-paying jobs, it's really to our collective benefit that we prepare all students for their role as an active, engaged citizen. And in our ideal world, they will actually come out of our program and other programs like it with the skills and the disposition to go and knock on the doors of the decision makers who are pulling the strings on the budget to say, from an equity policy, we need more funding for certain schools. And so that's the notion that we take and why we prioritize low-income students. And that's why we go into schools so that we can reach those students who aren't signing up for the leadership courses, who don't have access to the after-school programs, whose parents aren't funding the additional resources in the school. So they don't go off to government pretend camp and learn how to be a Supreme Court judge. We want to bring those skills to them.
It might help to add a little bit that we're an unusual country in that we have made a commitment to democracy, which we recognize from day one from our founding fathers required an educator's citizenry, right? That was very clear from day one. And yet we have a public funding formula for schools, which is highly unequitable. So that's really the problem that we're trying to solve here. So that's essential.
That is one of the problems we're trying to solve.
Yes,
Great.
that's true.
We've talked a little bit about the outreach to help students and adults understand how government works and a little bit of the civil discourse piece. But I think particularly in this political climate, we're finding that both students, youth, and adults are having a harder and harder time distinguishing between information that is factual, that is opinion, that is biased, that is flat out made up. Do you see with the nonprofits, either of your programs touching this, or from the business sector, I'm happy to open this up to any of you, how you are addressing the tremendous dissemination of endless information, often which conflicts?
This is one of the biggest problems. It's a huge growth area in schools. Teachers are clamoring for these kinds of resources. We have several resources that help take up this issue, specifically require. So just a disclaimer, we're a bunch of lawyers. I'm a lawyer, we're all lawyers. And so we pretty much know how to find evidence and how to teach kids how to find evidence in text and whether the evidence is credible or isn't credible. And so we've got several programs. We infuse all of our lesson plans, we have over 150 of them, with these news flashlights, which is basically a news and literacy aspect to the learning that you're getting. So want to make sure that, yes, you learn these points and you learn how the government works, you also go and find out what the news is about that and how to find credible evidence. We also always ask kids to take the other side. So if they're arguing one side, they also have to be able to argue the other side and find evidence, credible evidence for the other. If we all did that more, we'd be in a different place than we are now. So yeah, a huge growth area and one which we think is absolutely critical.
What are you seeing in the business environment?
I think we're at a point in time where there's a confluence of a bunch of different streams crashing together, and where we'll end up in just a few years, I'm not sure. But you have people in real time, individually, often mobilely, getting more information than anyone would have thought possible just a decade ago. And at the same time, you have especially right now in our climate, you have leaders questioning the validity, veracity of a host of traditionally recognized, credible sources. And so what you're starting to see is this, and it really is a problem in democracy. If there, the trust in government is so fundamental to this, the trust in both institutions that from a business perspective that we're talking about, and the synergy between democracy and capitalism, as one of those starts to fail, you need both of them to be healthy and strong. Anyway, in democracy, as a public starts to lose faith in both their leaders, in the information they're getting, in the institutions that exist, there are all sorts of crises that can come from that. And so I think you see, all of in the Valley, it's a huge issue, especially in the last year, of everybody trying to think about, with the tools or the platforms or whatever that they own, how they can source credible information, how they can help people sort through that, how they can help people self-select where they're getting their information, how they can help validate. But I don't know that we know yet where this is going. I think this is a space where a lot of people in this room who care about these issues can engage and help us as a community figure out how to do this. This is a huge, intractable problem, but we have to address it. It is critical, really, for the fundamentals of our democracy.
How do you manage that, Charlie, when grassroots level people are coming together, disseminating information on their own? It's so easy for rumors to start, for people to get themselves into a frenzy about something that may or may not be true.
I'd push back on that a little bit. I think the frenzy, at the small, so we operate at the small group level. Like most of the people who have projects on Civnet, it's like groups of 10 to 50 people who mostly know each other. And so I think the misinformation is much less pronounced there, because you have people who know each other and there's some built level of trust. Where you really see the disconnect is when you start going from that all the way up to institutions. So larger organizations, the more people you have, the less relationship you have, the less trust you end up having. And this has been happening for a long time. I think we're all in crisis mode because it seems so prominent, but this has been going on at least since the Nixon administration. If you look at the stats, trust in institutions has been steadily declining since that era, and I think it depends on what institution, but it's like now at like 10% for like trusting Congress and in the public. So I think my answer to that is to acknowledge that there's like good reason that the trust isn't there. As we've gotten bigger cities, as we've gotten bigger institutions, they tend to be less connected to what's actually going on at the community level, and therefore less responsive and more bureaucratic. And so I think community members, it's important to acknowledge that there's a lot of good reasons not to trust institutions and what's going on. And if you don't start there, it's gonna fall on deaf ears. And then I think the second piece of it is and at least our hypothesis is that you then need to build from the bottom back up. And to start at that small group level and empower those people to create change and influence the institutions. And if you're able to do that, then the trust comes naturally. And then they start listening to what the institutions are saying, because they know that what they're doing has meaningful influence over those institutions.
And if I may, that just brings us back then to the education component, because if you're raising another generation of citizens who haven't been taught how those institutions work, how to challenge them, how to make a difference, how to influence policy, et cetera, you really will end up in crisis at the end, because you'll have a citizenry that not only doesn't trust, but doesn't know how to engage or influence.
Thank you.
I will say, on a completely non-tech positive side, while I was serving in office, I was invited to come to a program called Citizens, and I get into this room and they said, come tell them what it's like to be a mayor. They're doing a summer camp that's all about engagement in civics and making a change. And so I come in, and they're elementary school, getting into middle school age kids, and I figured, well, let's walk through some of the basics. But before we started, I said, give me a tour of what you're doing. And they use Legos to build cities in teams. And so I'm like, they're massive cities here, right? Where I'm like, tell me about your city. And they were like, well, they give us challenges every week. Like, the city voted that they want to have a new recycling center. So we needed to run a bond measure first, and then we had to move and they're going through this whole thing. They're using terminology. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not here to talk to you about how to run a city. You really understand. They understood it and what the trade-offs were. They were understanding what the trade-offs were for different policies and the impact that would have in their community. So, as much as we can talk about some of these crises and crises of faith in institutions, et cetera, and the real need to teach civics in schools, there are also these points of light. And I think, one of the great benefits of the role that I play at Microsoft is that we get to search those out and find those and scale them and grow them and amplify that. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in the roles that we have and in the ways that we can to recognize these broader problems. And then when we're finding those solutions or those real game changers, to find ways to empower them and grow that work.
Thanks. We have a couple of audience questions that are touching on things that we haven't discussed yet, particularly data and the large amounts of it. This questioner wants to know, what about the democratization of data and broadband, and of course privacy on the other side of that? How can we use data to better bridge the equity gap?
I can go. I don't mean to hog the mic. I mean, data is, of course, for a company like Microsoft, front and center. It is just 10 or 15 years ago, we did not have the type of data sources accessible, that we didn't have the tools like the cloud to be able to manage them. We didn't have the changes in data science and data learning and machine learning that we have now. And it's leading to real policy influence and changes. I'll just give one example as it gets going here in San Jose as well. There was an initiative called Vision Zero, started in Scandinavia, looking at eliminating traffic fatalities and major injuries related to transportation. And for years, they've been working on policy solutions. Well, really, in the last decade, through a partnership with DataKind, which is an organization that looks at the use of data to solve social problems, and partnerships with universities, with cities, et cetera, we started working with them in New York and in New Orleans and in Seattle before coming here to San Jose, to aggregate these different data sources, to use that data learning in ways that, again, we couldn't have been able to a decade ago, to learn what real solutions are to traffic problems, and then to inform policymakers. I mean, that's really the goal, how to inform those policymakers to make better decisions. That data, the accessibility of it, the openness of it from government, the ability to manipulate it in ways that we haven't before, is fundamentally changing how policymakers can make decisions, I think, for the better. And so it's fantastic. There's so much opportunity there. And if people are interested in that space, I encourage you to engage in sort of these breakthroughs that are happening there.
Thanks. Maybe particularly with regard to the programs that you're all running, how do you, circling back to the fake news issue, how can you use either the gaming technology or the interactive community work to combat the fake news deluge?
Yeah. It's a huge issue, right? So we can't pretend like it doesn't exist. We can't pretend like that's not the fundamental piece. We simply have to teach the skills. There is a considerable amount of research and education research that tells us that we actually can teach this. So this is not, we're not reinventing any wheel right now. We know how to do this. We simply have to allocate the time in the classroom to do so. I do think that we're at a different point in civic education now where folks are understanding the consequences of not doing it for years. So I think there is a considerable amount of momentum to try to get sufficient time in the classroom to be able to do that, to be able to teach kids how our government works, but also how to take in what, consider the source. Is the source biased? Is the source not biased? Is it, who funded? We have 5 questions. We ask them, in terms of the newspaper. Who owns the newspaper? What about, look at the advertisers. Have they covered issues in a balanced way or not? And sort of find other sources that back up or cite that source. So these are all skills that are highly teachable. So I think we just have to get it done and make sure that every kid gets that training, and then we'll raise a different kind of generation. It's not that the problem is going to go away. It's a huge problem, but we can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add to that except to say like we ground a lot of our work in consensus building. So we kind of similar to how students have to take the other side, like we want them to be able to articulate why an issue is important, why that should become their issue. And then they do a lot of their own critical analysis of root causes and advocacy research. So they're pulling on different sources, but it's like, show me an institution that's not grappling with this issue. I think we're all sort of trying to figure this out together collectively, and I think that it's becoming a priority is a good thing, but it's still haunts us all.
There's one more.
Oh, sorry, I just had a quick comment. Besides the teaching the public piece of it, I think from a technology business perspective, we need to create business models that aren't predicated on basically addicting people and grabbing their attention span. I think that's a big piece of the problem, is that incentivizes a lot of sensationalist news and media and just giant quantities of it. And if you look at how the major social media platforms are designed, that's what they're designed to do. It's how many hours and minutes of attention can we grab per day. And so I think we need to think about creating business models that move away from that and figure out a different way for these people who are providing the news in many ways to make money.
One thing I might just add is, I think one of the things that gratifies me about our work is that we just launched in Central Texas and Oklahoma City, kind of getting off the liberal coast and getting into the heartland and red states. And we've been greeted with open arms, which I think is encouraging to see that there are opportunities out there to do some bridge building and where everybody can kind of get on the same page and agree on things. And so we're looking to kind of roll that out even further. We just launched a report for any folks that work in education. We just have a report for districts that are thinking about ways to build out an Action Civics initiative for their district. These are sort of best practices that we've pulled together from all around the country, ourselves and other models out there, as a way to just encourage and kind of build demand for Action Civics, with hopes that it ends up leading to more policy work. So we're trying to push on the policy and advocacy front as well, just so that we can put ourselves out of business around the country because schools are already setting this as a priority.
I would love to follow up with you about that report. Thank you. I've got one more audience question. I'm going to stick with Charlie, and then a slightly more personal one for each of you to finish us off here. There's a question from someone who is starting a civic engagement business or company and would like some advice on how to get started, who to partner with, and maybe you can play that off of your own experience.
That's a tough question. The one piece of advice I didn't take early on that I wish I had was to make sure you have a co-founder who's in it the same level that you are. I do now, but I didn't initially, and it made my life very difficult. And then the other thing that I'd like generically say to like any founder is like, be like real clear with yourself about how passionate you are about what you're doing, and be passionate enough about it that on the bad days, which are gonna happen, you're still able to keep going and get to the next stage. And I think if you can do those two things, the other things start coming, and happen, because it's tough starting a company, a civic tech company in particular, because you're struggling with very, very difficult problems that no one's really figured out how to solve yet, and there's a social good and business aspect of it. You need to really have that passion and be able to stick through it.
Thank you. Spoken by a successful civic tech entrepreneur. Last question. We have just a couple of minutes left. And I am interested, to the extent that you'd like to share, your personal biggest concerns if we fail to seize this moment in time to revitalize the civic and civil engagement of our youth and adult citizenries. Maybe just a sentence or two from each of you.
I can start. So I cited this morning a statistic that 25% of young people feel that democracy is a bad or very bad system. The other part of that report was that they also thought authoritarian regimes were actually quite good. And so that sort of, that's the danger. The danger is that when you see a system that isn't functioning properly because of this lack of trust in this deteriorating system in which we haven't invested, in which we've let this trust break down, is that you're going to look at other more efficient model, if you want to look, and find that attractive. And so that is a normal human response, I think, so I wouldn't blame anyone. However, for those who care about public policy and who care fundamentally about our democracy, that is not the answer. So we need to invest in education.
Thanks. What's anyone else scared of?
I mean, I think that, you know, for me, I'm always concerned with who's at the table and who's getting their voice heard. And you know, for me, I champion youth voice. You know, I feel like when they're given the opportunity to participate, they rise to the occasion. And when they're given the opportunity to think critically about an issue, they can articulate why something is a good or bad idea. And so, you know, that first step is often the hardest. It's like, for me to get to the gym, it's just, you know, making the decision. But once I'm there, you know, you get into the groove. You know, we want to make that kind of remove the barriers of entry and make it as accessible for people to get engaged. And I think once they see that there's access, once they show up to the school board meeting or the city council meeting, or they speak to a city department and they go, oh, wow, they listen to me. Oh, I do have agency. Oh, this is what it means to participate. Then it sets them on the track to be a lifelong participant. And to miss that first step, it seems so crucial. And so what scares me is that we don't make that first access point available more broadly to more people.
Thank you.
Well, I'd say, you know, one of my worries, and I tend to be pretty optimistic, but one of my worries is that we will, the change is happening so quickly. And there are communities that are left behind in that, some still without access and in other ways. And there are policy implications for so many of these changes that we, I don't think, are having thoughtful dialogues about yet. And just one example, the last panel, I was at a conference recently, there was a whole conference on transportation and autonomous vehicles, et cetera. And there were so many people there really excited about the idea that within a short amount of time, all of the 18-wheelers, all of the taxis, right, all of these different vehicles will be autonomously driven. And it is, you know, someone there said, here in Silicon Valley, everybody seems so excited about this. But, you know, where I'm from, we're thinking about the fact that 3 million people in this country are employed driving those cars and those taxis and anything. And who is planning for that? Like, who's thinking about skills training for all of those people? The same with, you know, Amazon. You can walk right out of the store, it scans you, and you don't have to pay, you don't have to do a checkout stand. Yeah, but there are millions of lower and middle skill workers who are in these industries. And I think we saw a lot of that reflected in the last campaign, where people were saying there's globalization taking place, there is technology advancement taking place, and I am being left behind, and no one seems to care. And I think that that is terrifying to me, because I think the pace of change just continues to increase. Changes in how we live will continue to increase. It is fundamentally affecting people's lives and their productivity in positive ways, but it has adverse effects, and it's some of these sweeping changes are having adverse effects for millions of people at a time in their livelihood. And I don't know if from a policy consideration point we're having the right dialogues around that.
Charlie, the last 90 seconds are yours.
Yeah, I got the good one. I used to be scared. I'm not as scared when I think about it now. I think the reason for that, for some reason, Alex de Tocqueville came to mind. If you know him, he's a French guy who came to the US when it was very early on. And he said that the unique thing about Americans is that, or people in the United States, is that they bootstrap things. If there's a problem in their community, they fix it and they do something about it. And I do think there's something, particularly if you like compare us to other countries, if you go and talk to people, I think there's still a belief that we can change things and that we should change things. It would worry me if that went away. I think as long as we have that and we have that expectation, the institutions failing and everything else, it's problematic. But I think people's reaction to what's going on hasn't been like, let's lay over and you know, go away. It's been like, okay, let's do about it. And I think that's, as long as we have that, I think there's hope. And so I'll try to end it on a positive note.
There you go.
Please join me in thanking this fabulous and thoughtful panel.